The period around 10 years after the Great War, 1914 to 1918, saw a rich outpouring of memoirs by those affected by the war. Edmund Blunden's Undertones of War was published in 1928, as was Siegfried Sassoon's Memoirs of a Fox-Hunting Man, the first volume of a three-part war memoir. Erich Maria Remarque's All Quiet on the Western Front was published in 1929, as was Mary Borden's The Forbidden Zone, and Robert Graves's Goodbye to All That. 1929 also saw publication of Frederick Manning's The Middle Parts of Fortune, an expurgated version of which appeared in 1930 as Her Private Sui. By 1933, Vera Brittain had published Testament of Youth, and in 1937, David Jones's In Parenthesis appeared. At the same time, other, less literary memoirs were appearing, such as David Lloyd George's War Memoirs in 1938. This torrent of literary effort established a way of viewing the Great War that is still operative today. While some historians today dispute the idea that the troops were lions led by donkeys, a view compounded by the 1963 stage musical Oh What a Lovely War, adapted as a film in 1969 by Richard Attenborough, for the most part, scholars feel reasonably comfortable taking these post-war memoirs as fairly accurate representations of the war. However, to say this is to fail to mention several significant facts. Women's texts, such as Borden's memoir of working as a nurse in a MASH-like frontline hospital, went out of print soon after initial publication because they did not fit the image of the war that was emerging from men's memoirs. Similarly, memoirs that portrayed the war experience in too sunny a light were discounted and fell into disfavor. Arguably, All Quiet on the Western Front, a huge bestseller in multiple languages, and an eventual target of Hitler's attempt to clean up the German version of the war, influenced the production of war memoirs and the thinking on which kinds of memoirs could be considered authentic. During the war, there was certainly a great deal of writing going on, already attempting to frame a narrative of the war. Not only in novels like Henri Barbusse's Under Fire, but also in Soldiers' Letters Home, Wilfred Owen's letters to his mother are gripping enough to be first drafts of a brilliant memoir he didn't live long enough to write. Soldiers, war workers, national and military leaders, and non-combatants were laying the groundwork in both public and private writing for an understanding of the Great War that was not yet available to its participants. Meanwhile, in Ypres in early 1916, some men from the Sherwood Foresters Regiment came upon a small printing press and, like others before them, decided to publish a trench newspaper. That paper, the Wipers Times and its successors, the New Church Times, the Kemmel Times, the Somme Times, the BEF Times, and the Better Times, became the best known of several trench papers. Produced under challenging conditions, Ypres was one of the most active fronts of the war, and the Sherwood Foresters, a pioneer or engineering battalion, saw a great deal of action. The Wipers Times attempts to relieve the tedium of trench warfare with humor and to divert its readers' attention from the terror of constant shelling through parody and jest. War memoirs attempt to sew together a coherent narrative to explain the events and effects of a terrible and chaotic war on the humans involved in it. The strong human desire to make sense, to find a narrative line that seems reasonable and plausible, may explain why war narratives emerging in that rich period 10 years after the war began to look alike, and why narratives that didn't or couldn't follow that narrative line disappeared from popular view. For trench newspapers like the Wipers Times, though, the task was quite different. Shrugging at the notion of making sense of the craziness around them, these papers reveled in the fragmented world of wartime for its comedic possibilities. Each edition of the Wipers Times, for instance, opens with an advertisement for entertainments to be held in Ypres's medieval Cloth Hall, the best ventilated hall in town. Cloth Hall was the object of repeated German bombardment because of its height and visibility. letters from correspondents dispute the right to claim hearing the first cuckoo of the season, suggest surrounding the British Isles with a high barbed wire entanglement to minimize danger from zeppelins, and complain that lately the lighting by night of Oxford and Regent Street trenches has been terribly neglected, star shells being sent up in very irregular intervals. The Wipers Times features regular serials, beginning with Shot in the Culvert, in which Sherlock Sholmes is at it again. In the first installment of this serial, after 3 sentences of scene setting, in the Pink, a pioneer, plodded his way, clad in gumboots thigh pairs 1, and soliloquized aloud thus: "What a blooming dime! They gives me a blooming nail, they gives me a blooming 'ammer, and then they tells me to go and build a blooming dugout." But before Inda gets a whack at building his dugout, he fell into a crump hole, and then continued his soliloquies thus. At that point, the narrative is to be continued whenever the next edition of the Wipers Times emerges. This pattern continues throughout the run of the Wipers Times and its successors. In the last edition of the Wipers Times, before the 24th Sherwood Foresters move on to another sector at the front, the Sherlock Sholmes serial dispatches Sholmes, who comes a purler over a loose duckboard, and the Pink, who loses his love interest to a visit from Silent Percy, long-range artillery whose shells landed before the report from the gun could be heard, and Chumley Marchbanks, a fashionable gentleman introduced for the purpose of falling into the beck Sholmes has just climbed out of, then promises next week a new set of characters and another thrilling installment. As it happens, it will be some weeks before the serial and the paper returns, as the war interferes with its production. But even here, before the editors know they're taking a break, the writer displays no concern for the usual rules of narrative construction. The war presents a fragmented world to the combatants. The Wipers Times echoes that fragmentation with a quality of manic glee. Stephen Kern has called the First World War the Cubist War, in part because the war ripped up the historical fabric and cut everyone off from the past suddenly and irretrievably. This intensified the sense of the present, the disjunction from past and future, the emotionally and physically demanding nature of the ongoing experience, and the simultaneity of multiple distant events that were shared by hundreds of thousands of men in battle and witnessed by the civilian population who attempted to draw those events together into a single coherent pattern. For the soldier editor-publishers of the Wipers Times, the breaks and disjunctions of the war, even spatial dislocations reflected in the paper's name until, uncertain where they would be posted from week to week, they settled on the more all-purpose BEF Times, admirably suited the visual and narrative platform of the trench newspaper. Assembling the paper from comrades' submissions, filling gaps with typographic embellishments, mocking the quartermaster's division and the general staff as soldiers always do, the editors echoed the fragmentary and disorienting spatial and temporal landscapes of the war. Narratives were shortened or lengthened to fill out blank spaces. One could even have a poem called Stopgap, just long enough to fill out a page. Little stacks of sandbags, little lumps of clay, make our blooming trenches in which we work and play. Merry little whiz-bang, jolly little crump, make our trench a picture, wiggle woggle wump. Or, on a more somber note, this untitled poem. An awful thought has come to me, a sad disaster that might be. Just suppose a 12-inch shell fell right on this dugout. Well, this train of thought I'll not pursue. That fills the gap, and so will do. Both of these poems have as their primary purpose gap-filling, rather than communicating some truth about the war. They describe trench scenes in ways that are familiar to those who live in them, but don't necessarily reach out to any other audience. Stopgap lightheartedly both mocks and enacts the cheery attitude of the British forces so beloved by poster makers of the Great War. The untitled poem edges right up to the reality of trench life, before veering aside into the pragmatic problem of filling a blank spot in the newspaper's page. Thus, the poems speak to those who already know, a common theme recited in introductory remarks to World War I memoirs, that the text is written for those who already know and thus don't need it, and that those who need the text in order to understand will never get it anyway. These poems, and the newspapers in which they appear, avoid not just sentimentality, but also any ammunition for those at home who would like to create sentimental and stereotyped portraits of warriors and the war. Memoirists felt similarly protective of their war experiences, and yet, unlike the trench newspapers, which were written entirely for the publisher's fellow soldiers, though also shared with friends on the home front, memoirs deliberately seek out an audience of those who weren't there and who experienced the war vicariously through the memoir. This creates for writers a tricky problem, one which most of them felt they hadn't handled perfectly, of speaking the unspeakable and capturing in narrative that which defies ordering and sense. Edmund Blunden's memoir, Undertones of War, makes a common choice for war memoirs in being episodic, thus enacting the fragmentary and disjointed experience of soldiers moving from sector to sector and into and out of battle. As in the war, the passage of time alone moves the action of the memoir forward. There is no sense that its events are connected, that anyone is learning, growing, or changing because of its events, or that the events are finally meaningful, reducible to a story that could possibly make sense according to any narrative rules that might be devised. Blunden narrates his experiences with remarkably blank affect, maintaining a distance from the reader that is perhaps more extreme than in other war memoirs and novels, but not really different in kind. Blunden also chooses an elevated, self-consciously literary style, one that reflects his professional training and aspirations, but that also has similar distancing effects to the stopgap poems. So, for instance, he remembers a house in Bethune, outside the immediate battle zone. Peaceful little one, standest thou still, cool nook, earthly paradisal cupboard with leaf-green light to see poetry by. I fear 1918 was the ruin of thee. For my refreshment, one night's sleep, I'll call thee friend, not inanimate. Blunden's memoir continues to be frequently read, though more in the UK than here, and provided source material for Pat Barker's Regeneration. Blunden isn't writing about shell shock, though I would argue that his whole book is an enactment of it. The blank affect, the self-conscious distancing of readers from the text, and the deployment of literary tropes and devices to break up the forward flow of the narrative at key moments all operate to prohibit sentimentality and to underline the personal, unshareable nature of the story. Fragmentation in Blunden isn't just a reflection of how the war felt to combatants. Rather, it is a device Blunden uses to compartmentalize his narrative's emotive moments in order to restrain them. Like repression, this isolation of feeling aims to preserve Blunden from reliving the trauma of the war, even as he narrates the bare details of his experience. But as World War I psychiatrist W.H.R. Rivers suggests, many of the most trying and distressing symptoms from which the subjects of war neurosis suffer are not the necessary result of the strain and shocks to which they have been exposed in warfare, but are due to the attempt to banish from the mind distressing memories of warfare or painful affective states which have come into being as a result of their war experience. Thus, one might read Undertones of War as an extended enactment of war neurosis, while Blunden tells his war stories in the memoir, which comports with Rivers' suggestion that patients need to talk about rather than suppress their war experience. He does so in a way that veers away from the horrors he experienced, presenting them numbly and circumventing all negative feelings, or at least minimizing them. This fragmentation and compartmentalization has implications for Blunden's memoirs, as for other memoirs and novels sharing similar characteristics. The attempt to create a coherent narrative from war experiences fails because of the psychological need to contain the experiences, yet in Blunden's memoir at least, this need for containment and its implications function to govern the narrative, so that the coherent story Blunden's book tells is that the war is unnarratable. This comports with the Wipers Times strategy for addressing real emotion. The French at Verdun are cited as people we take our hats off to, but nowhere else, and frustration with the progress of the war emerges only in the Things We Want to Know column, which asks 1. Who invented the salient? 2. Why? Meanwhile, the paper mocks both pronouncements from on high and slack officers in Questions a Platoon Commander Should Ask Himself. Am I as offensive as I might be? This image shows an officer with his hand in his pocket, carrying a golf club and wearing slacks and shoes and what look like fashionable clocked socks. In doing so, the paper asserts its audience of insiders. Those in the know deride officers like the one in the cartoon, and scoff at the General Staff's edict to platoon combatants about the proper offensive spirit during a trench war privileging defensive strategies. Both kinds of war journals, then, take pains to establish that their subject matter cannot be narrated, only experienced and known. They are narratives about inevitable narrative failure, the inability of narrative to comprehend and to relate the experience of the Great War.